I basically want to follow up on a number of things that we discussed this morning, and I'm very much going to group it into three bins. So I'm going to talk about three kind of separate issues, but kind of related, and they all got to do with how we define the new normal and what we should think about macroeconomic policy or economic policy in general in the future. So one major thing I'm sure everybody in this room is convinced about is that volatility has been a major problem for this region, for our region, and macroeconomic policy has in most cases actually not contributed to reducing that volatility, has actually exacerbated that volatility. And as Raimundo showed, oil price volatility is most likely not going to decline in the near future. So then the other thing I want to touch on is the new global oil order. Are we in a new oil order? What is the new oil order? And the idea basically is that we're in a low oil price environment with movements in a very narrow band. And I'm going to argue that that might not be the case, mainly because, as we all know, oil markets equilibrate, but they do take time. There might potentially be a long lead. And the last thing I want to talk about, something actually that I'm really kind of passionate about, is the issue with climate change volatility in this region. I think it's a serious issue, and it's an issue that we do not address enough, and I think there is a major scope for macroeconomic policy to contribute to this area. And I'm not going to, I'm given 14 minutes or 13 minutes now, I'm not going to talk about stranded assets. That's actually a major issue for this region. There are $1 trillion worth of assets that might not be mainly the things on the ground which might not be extracted if we are to obey the targets that we set, for instance, from the Paris Agreement. There's obviously also water and environmental crisis, which has been exacerbated by policy, and in particular, energy subsidies. In my view, is a big issue. But I'm going to concentrate on direct and long-run effects of climate change on economic growth, productivity, labor supply, and so on. Okay, so just very quickly, as you can see from the graph, the green, if you can't identify the countries, but the group of countries, the green ones are the MENA countries. So actually there's a Middle East, there's a purple one which is North Africa. But as you can see, except for the global financial crisis, this region has been subject to huge volatility. I give you a concrete example. The volatility in GDP growth in the GCC countries, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, is about 3 times as large as that of Chile and Norway. And that's a substantial volatility this is annual volatility that we are subject to. And I think I want to echo what Raimundo was just saying, that we basically need better or stronger institutions, and we need better macroeconomic policy going forward. And that's not the 3 things that Raimundo said are key: fiscal responsibility, monetary responsibility, and intertemporal responsibility are key in that. So I don't need to convince you, I think. I've just done some scatter plots from some work that we did earlier with Mehdi Raisi at the IMF, is that you can see that there is this negative association between GDP growth volatility and GDP growth. Higher GDP growth volatility tends to reduce GDP growth rates. And there's also a positive association between commodity price volatility and GDP growth volatility. And in quantitative work, we've actually shown that while oil or commodity revenues have actually been a blessing for the region, what's actually been the main problem we quantified is the volatility in these revenues that we are subject to. And that's a very important thing. And there are ways to offset this. And the problem is, it's not that it's not affecting total factor productivity or the physical capital accumulation. These volatilities actually have long-term implications, because the scatter plots show, and again we show it in quantitative work, that the key is that the volatility reduces the possibility for technological progress, reduces the ability of our countries. And the other issue is it hits capital accumulation very hard, which essentially implies the long-run growth rates are reduced. So one of the things that we talk about intertemporal responsibility, think about sovereign wealth funds. At the moment, I mean, the sovereign wealth funds are very topical. They're being set up all over the place over the last 2 decades. I mean, most of the resource-rich countries have some type of sovereign wealth fund. And the idea is to, first is the intertemporal, obviously thinking about future generations. And the second issue is about fiscal stabilization. So I think in the region, they have done what we show is that overall, having a sovereign wealth fund is actually good for a nation. So using data over the last 40 years, we can establish that a sovereign wealth fund, a country with a sovereign wealth fund, has on average done better than one without. The problem is rules. I mean, then within this group of sovereign wealth funds, there are a lot of countries. If you take the top 29, within those 29, there's a huge heterogeneity in the things that Raimondo was talking about. Rules, how do we establish it? How do we monitor it? Who can dip in and who can dip out of the sovereign wealth fund? And the problem is, in fact, what it turns out to be is that, as is kind of intuitive, is the sovereign wealth funds with good institutions, the countries who have good institutions, and I'm talking about fiscal policy, and have good monetary policy and sort of intertemporal responsibilities, those countries have actually tended to be able to dampen the negative effects of the commodity price volatility. And this graph basically shows you GDP growth volatility and fiscal policy volatility. You can think about fiscal policy volatility as the component of discretionary policy which you do not attribute to stabilizing the sort of smoothing the business cycle. Think about it as the injections of cash or the social expenditures in the GCC after the Arab Spring. So these things have a huge destabilizing effect on the macroeconomy. And you can see that quite clearly, that there's a negative association between institutional quality and fiscal policy volatility. It doesn't matter if you just look at oil producers or you look at all types of commodities, including Chile, copper. So the key thing is we need to manage the resource income better. Sovereign wealth funds is one way of doing it. Oil stabilization funds is another way of doing it. But we need to have good institutions, good rules. And the other issue is that governments should be more proactive into investing in physical capital. And some countries in the region that's actually done quite well when private investment is low. One can also talk about complementarities between physical and human capital, increasing human capital to increase TFP and growth in the future. So, and the crucial thing is financial markets. We do not have very good capital markets in the MENA region. Talking about Iran, for instance, when there's an oil price shock, basically the movement in the consumption, investment, in economic growth is massive. And then it dips out after a year. As consumers, we like to smooth things out. We don't want to be subject to shocks every 3 or 4 years. So that improving of the financial markets can mitigate some of the negative effects on capital accumulation and on the uncertainty that households are faced. So the second issue was, are we in a new global oil order? So obviously technological innovation, very fast, reduced prices, in particular of unconventional oil. And 4 years ago, if you spoke to anybody in the oil market, they would say, well, tight oil production is just like manufacturing. It's fantastic because we can quickly turn the tap on and we can quickly turn the tap off. Conventional production, not so much, because it has huge lead times for investment and then lead times for it to come online. So this is going to change the nature of the oil markets in 2 ways. One, oil prices will not go above about $60 a barrel, which is the break-even price if you want to offer shale oil. And the second thing is that the movement will be very small. It will be between $60 and $40. There won't be much movement in prices. Okay? And the most important thing was that US will become a major player in the global oil markets to stabilize demand and supply. Okay? So that was that was the basic idea. So as we all know, and as I mentioned in the beginning, oil markets equilibrate, but oil markets take some time to equilibrate. And what we have seen over the last year or so is that in fact, this morning in the Financial Times, the head of Saudi Aramco said, you know, guys, upstream investment in oil, in conventional oil, is down a lot, and it is down a lot. Over the last 3 or 4 years, it's substantially fallen, mainly because oil companies want to go into short-run projects like shale, or they're diversifying into renewables. But this has huge implication for oil supply in 4 to 5 years. By 2022, it's not clear that we will have enough demand from shale, enough supply from shale oil to satisfy this major demand, and which basically implies that oil prices will be pushed further up. And I think this is a huge problem. And you can also see more recently, oil prices have gone up by about 50% The idea was that the US shale oil revolution will take off. The problem is that US shale producers, the small companies, are now becoming accountable to people who are investing in them. It's not just about drill, drill, drill. It's actually about giving dividends and making profits. So the nature of the shale oil is also changing. And I really like this. On Thursday, Goldman Sachs was basically telling people to start buying commodities. Not explicitly, but implicitly. So that's the major thing. Which brings me to the other factor. It's the Trump factor. So actually, I don't know if you follow, I've just joined Twitter recently, and I'm following President Trump, and he gives instructions about what oil prices should be. And so is President Trump a new sort of swing factor in global oil markets? And arguably, the Trump administrations have many, many objectives, and some of them are sending mixed signals to the oil markets. And I'm going to talk about 3 issues. So one issue is the geopolitical agenda, and that's really about sanctions on Iran. So the administration actually demanded that oil exports from Iran should go to 0. That's 2 million barrels lost, substantial amount of 2 million barrels of exports lost from Iran. The other issue is that obviously in November midterms are coming up, and there is a domestic political agenda to keep petrol prices low for the elections. And then finally, what we refer to is the trade wars with China and the EU, which again moves commodity markets in opposite directions. So I think the Trump factor should not be underestimated. In fact, it is very possible that if oil prices remain around $80 a barrel, before the election, the president releases oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It could be substantial amounts, up to 30 million barrels. But one thing is clear, it's created more uncertainty. It creates more and more uncertainty, which creates more and more volatility, which obviously is not such a new thing to me. That seems to be what business as usual. The problem is players have changed. OPEC is now collaborating with Russia and the other 11 major oil producers, shale oil production in the US, and then you have the US administration in this. Okay, so I think the key issue, the volatility, is the issue for policymakers. That's what one should take into account, and it's not just about sustained low or high levels of oil prices. So volatility is key. Okay, do I have 3 minutes to? Excellent. So this is I want to talk a little bit about this. Is that another problem with volatility, which I think we're going to be hit with quite severely, is the climate change volatility. So we have the oil price volatility. We have volatility exacerbated possibly by some policies in the region, and then we have this sort of climate change volatility. And this climate change policy or observations have actually gone back to Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah in the 14th century, in which he tries to attribute poverty to climate. And Montesquieu later came and said, basically, you need to essentially force people to work in hot climates. And Huntington, later on, many centuries later, used actually microdata to show that climate change is terrible for production. This is a graph. I'm not sure you can see it very well, but if you look at the bottom 3, it shows you the deviation. So the middle line is if there's no changes in temperature. If you go to the right, it basically temperature increases above a norm, what you're used to. And if you go below, you go to the left, it reduces. The 3 bottom ones are basically cigar makers in Tampa, Florida. And this over 3 years, I think 1911, 12, 13. And what that shows is that the activity, human activity, substantially drops as temperatures deviate from a norm. And you could also see in a work where places were either too cold or too warm to sort of a mean of the global temperatures are basically seen as disrupting human energy. So one of the things economists tend to do is think about geography and think about climate and say, can the climate explain why some nations are not doing as well as they should do? The thing is, what is the kind of crucial question is, what is the effect on climate change or weather shocks on economic growth and sort of total factor productivity and labor supply going forward? Okay, and this is very important for this region, obviously, because climate change is going to hit this region severely, droughts, and so on. And we really need to incorporate this into macroeconomic economic policy and macroeconomic policy. And I'm not talking about stranded assets here. I'm talking about the direct effects of climate change volatility on labor productivity, labor supply, sectors, and so on, okay? So, as you know, the commitment is to keep temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius, not go above 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels. And whether it's achievable or not, that's a different discussion, but that's the idea. And that really has some fiscal cost to this region. But actually, adaptation could help development in the region. I'm going to come to that in a second. Can I take one minute? I want to show, I'm not going to show you the tables, I have the tables, but one thing that is clear, what we've done in the US, is that we've shown that in the US, these deviations of climate, this arguably the most advanced economy, have adapted to some extent, do have some mitigation policies. In the US, the effects of climate change volatility is massive on economic growth. And it works in every single sector. I'm not going to show you the tables, but it works in every single sector: agriculture, transportation, manufacturing, construction. Climate change hits every single sector based on last 50 years data. So this implies that for this region could be potentially substantial. But the problem, the thing I want to argue is that economic policy using adaptation strategies such as better water usage, climate resilience of housing, robust crops, and so on, these could actually lead to higher development in the region. Okay, I will stop there.